The late afternoon sun cast long golden stripes across the Petersons' manicured lawn, illuminating the dancing dust motes in the still air of their living room. Inside, the silence was a comfortable, well-worn blanket, stitched together by 42 years of shared understanding. Jean Peterson, 65, with laugh lines etched around her kind eyes from 3 decades of smiling at third graders, watched her husband, Frank, from her favorite armchair. He was hunched over a small card table, the retired accountant's intense focus now directed not at ledgers, but at the delicate inner workings of a silver locket he'd rescued from a flea market. Their small suburban home was a museum of their peaceful rhythm. Frank's meticulously organized tools in the garage, the scent of Jean's peace roses wafting through the open kitchen window, and the neat stacks of travel brochures on the coffee table. I was reading about the Hubbard Glacier," Frank said without looking up, his voice a low, gentle rumble that always made Jean feel safe. "They say when the ice calves, it sounds like thunder. White thunder." Jean smiled, setting aside her book. "As long as it's not actual thunder, my storm-chasing days are over." Their upcoming retirement trip was a constant, pleasant topic of conversation. For months, they had waffled between the cool, majestic blues of an Alaskan cruise and the warm, fiery oranges of the Arizona canyons. It was a wonderful, impossible choice. "Just think, Frank, no more alarm clocks. No more shoveling snow unless we absolutely feel like it. We've earned this." "That we have, Jeannie," he agreed, finally setting down his loop and holding up the locket, its surface now gleaming under the lamplight. "Look at this. Almost new. Can you imagine the stories this thing could tell?" "Probably that it's happy to be out of that dusty old box and in the hands of a magician," she said, rising from her chair and walking over to him. "You have a magic touch, Frank. Always have." He set the locket down carefully on a velvet cloth and reached for her hand, his fingers warm and familiar, calloused from his years of gardening and woodworking. 42 years, and you still say the nicest things. We're lucky, Good health, a roof over our heads, and a nephew who's a top heart doctor, just in case these old tickers ever act up. He patted his chest with a chuckle. The mention of Eric, their sister's son, brought a swell of pride to Jean. He was their shining star. The moment was perfect, another small, beautiful tile in the mosaic of their life together. Jean squeezed his hand and went to the kitchen to check on the pot roast. Its savory aroma a promise of the comforting meal to come. She was setting the table, placing their matching floral-patterned plates just so, humming a soft tune, when she heard it. Not a shout or a crash, but a sharp, guttural gasp from the living room, a sound of air being stolen. It was followed by the sickening, heavy thud of a body hitting the floor. Time seemed to warp, stretching into an eternity, and then snapping back with brutal speed. Jean dropped a fork. Its metallic clatter on the linoleum was unnaturally loud in the sudden, terrifying void of silence. "Frank?" she called out, her voice a reedy, trembling thing she didn't recognize. No answer. "Frank!" She rushed into the living room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The scene that met her eyes would be burned into her memory forever. He was on the floor, sprawled on the floral rug beside his favorite armchair, which now looked monstrously empty. One hand was clenched over his chest in a desperate white-knuckled grip, his face a mask of ashen gray, his lips tinged with a horrifying shade of blue. His eyes, usually so full of gentle humor, were wide with a mixture of shock, pain, and confusion. The newly polished silver locket lay beside his outstretched hand, forgotten. The comfortable silence of their home had been murdered, replaced by the sound of Jean's own ragged, panicked breaths as she fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick and useless, barely able to dial the 3 numbers that now held the entire weight of her world. The hospital was a symphony of sanitized chaos, a place where time was measured in the rhythmic beeping of machines and the soft squeak of rubber-soled shoes on polished floors. Jean sat on a hard plastic chair in the cardiac wing's waiting room, a flimsy paper cup of coffee growing cold in her trembling hands. A junior resident, kind but looking impossibly young, had tried to explain things to her, his words a confusing jumble of medical jargon. Arrhythmia, troponin levels, potential blockage, observation. He meant to be reassuring, but the clinical Terms only deepened the chasm between her world and this terrifying new one, where Frank's life hung in the balance. She felt utterly alone, an analog relic in a digital age of medicine she couldn't comprehend. Just as a wave of despair threatened to swallow her whole, a figure of calm authority appeared at the end of the long, pale green hallway. It was her nephew, Dr. Eric Vance. At 38, he was the pride of the family, a man who radiated success. He wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, not scrubs, and on his wrist, a sleek silver watch glinted under the fluorescent lights. He moved with an air of unassailable confidence that seemed to part the sea of hospital bustle before him. "Aunt Jean?" he said, his voice a calm, resonant baritone as he enveloped her in a firm hug that felt like an anchor. "I came as soon as Mom called. I am so sorry. How are you holding up?" The dam of her composure broke. Tears she hadn't realized she was holding back finally spilled over, hot and silent. "Oh, Eric, I'm so scared. They're saying so many things and I don't understand any of it. They won't let me see him." He gently pulled back, his handsome face serious, and looked her directly in the eyes. "That stops now. Don't you worry about a thing. I'm here. I'll handle it." He wasn't just offering comfort, he was making a declaration. He strode to the nurse's station and Jean watched, mesmerized, as his entire demeanor shifted. He was no longer just her loving nephew. He was Dr. Vance, a commander entering his domain. The staff, who had been brisk and professional with her, became deferential, their posture straightening. He didn't raise his voice, but his questions were sharp, specific, and cut through the medical fog. He reviewed Frank's chart with a focused intensity, his brow furrowed. He had a brief, quiet conversation with Dr. Thorne, the attending physician, and Jean saw the older doctor nodding, a clear transfer of authority taking place. A few minutes later, Eric returned, his expression serious but reassuring. "Okay, I've spoken with everyone. They've stabilized him, which is the most important thing. But I'm going to be honest, his preliminary chart is more complex than a small community hospital like this is equipped to fully interpret. These places are fine for routine issues, but this is Frank. I'm officially taking over his case management. I'll coordinate with the staff here, but all major decisions will go through me. I'm having his test results sent to my office for a more thorough analysis. He's going to get the best care, Jean. I promise you." A wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees washed over her. The terror didn't vanish, but it receded, pushed back by the sheer force of Eric's competence. He was her white knight in a tailored suit, a beacon of expertise in this terrifying foreign land. He was family. He was a heart doctor. He would save Frank. She placed her fragile world into his capable hands, gratitude swelling in her chest so intensely it ached. "Thank you, Eric," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Thank you. I don't know what I would do without you." He simply nodded, his face a mask of solemn duty, before turning back toward the critical care unit, ready to do battle for her. 2 days later, Frank was resting in a private room, a privilege Eric had arranged. The persistent metronomic beeping of the heart monitor was a grim soundtrack to their new reality, a constant reminder of the fragility of the man lying so still in the bed. That evening, Eric arrived at their house, letting himself in with the spare key they'd given him years ago. He declined Jean's offer of coffee and gestured for her to sit at the kitchen table, the same table where she and Frank had shared 42 years of meals, arguments, and laughter. The gesture felt strangely formal, and the knot of dread that had been living in her stomach since the 911 call tightened into a cold, hard fist. Eric sat opposite her, his handsome face carefully composed into an expression of practiced gravity. He folded his hands on the polished oak surface, a picture of somber professionalism. "Aunt Jean," he began, his voice low and serious, compelling her full attention. "I've spent the last 48 hours going over every single one of Frank's test results. I didn't want to rely solely on my own interpretation, so I had them couriered to a specialist colleague in Geneva, a leader in degenerative cardiac diseases. I didn't want to worry you until I was absolutely certain." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room, letting the mention of an international specialist underscore the gravity of the situation. The initial diagnosis of simple angina, which the doctors gave you here, was tragically optimistic. It's what you'd call a textbook diagnosis for a man his age, but Frank's case is anything but textbook. He is suffering from a very aggressive and rare form of cardiomyocytic degeneration. It's a genetic flaw that has remained dormant his entire life, and it has now been triggered. In layman's terms, the muscle cells of his heart are not just weakening, they are actively beginning to die off. He let that horrific image sink in. John felt the blood drain from her face, a cold numbness spreading through her limbs. What does that mean?" she managed to ask, her voice a dry whisper. "It means that standard treatments, the blood thinners, the beta blockers they have him on, they're like trying to stop a tidal wave with a handful of sand. They might manage the symptoms for a few weeks, a few months at best, but they won't stop the underlying progression." He leaned forward, his gaze unwavering and filled with a deep, convincing sympathy. "But I have been on the phone with my colleague around the clock. There is an option. It's an experimental enzyme therapy being pioneered by their clinic in Switzerland. It's a revolutionary treatment that uses a bioengineered catalyst to stimulate cellular regeneration in the heart muscle. It's not approved by the FDA yet, which is why it's not covered by any insurance, American or otherwise. But the results from their Phase 3 trials are remarkable. It's a complete game changer." He paused again. "It's expensive, Jean. Very expensive. But frankly," he leaned even closer, his voice dropping to an intimate, urgent near whisper, "it's his only real hope." The words hung in the air, a death sentence and a lifeline woven together. Jean's mind reeled. In the air. She asked the desperate questions. "Are there other options? Payment plans? Other trials?" Eric had an answer for everything. The condition was too aggressive for other, slower treatments. The clinic required full payment upfront to synthesize the patient-specific enzymes. It was now or never. He had masterfully cornered her, leaving her with no alternative but the one he was presenting. "How much?" she asked, the two words feeling like shards of glass in her throat. Eric slid a single, neatly folded piece of paper across the table. It contained a long string of numbers, an international bank account, and a figure that made her gasp, sucking all the air from her lungs. "The full course of treatment, including the synthesis and transport, is $480,000, he said softly, his voice full of sorrowful resignation. "It's everything I know. But Jean, it's his only shot." Sleep offered no escape that night. It was a black, churning ocean of anxiety. Jean lay beside the empty, cool space in her bed, the scent of Frank's pillow a tormenting reminder of his absence. Every time she closed her eyes, two numbers burned behind her eyelids. 42, the years of her marriage, a lifetime of shared history, and 480,000, the impossible price of keeping it from ending. The choice Eric had presented her with replayed in an endless, torturous loop. He had framed it as a choice, but it was an illusion. It was a ransom note for her husband's life, delivered with a sympathetic smile. The Alaskan glaciers melted away, the Arizona canyons crumbled to dust, all their dreams dissolving into the sterile, imagined image of a Swiss clinic. The money they had scrimped and saved, the vacations they'd postponed, the old car they'd driven until it died, every sacrifice was now distilled into this single, horrifying figure. By the time the first pale gray light of dawn filtered through the blinds, exhaustion had given way to a grim, hollow resolve. She would do it. Of course she would do it. There was no other path. She showered and dressed with the mechanical movements of an automaton, a strange sense of disassociation settling over her. The bank felt cold and alien, a cathedral of commerce that was about to claim her life's work. She sat opposite a kind-faced young man named David, whose name tag proclaimed him a financial relationship manager. He smiled warmly as she explained what she needed to do, but his smile faltered, replaced by a look of professional concern, as she stated the amount. "Mrs. Peterson, that's the entirety of your retirement portfolio," he said, his tone shifting from pleasant to cautious. "Liquidating the whole amount will incur significant early withdrawal penalties from the IRAs. We're talking tens of thousands of dollars in taxes and fees alone. Are you absolutely certain? Before we proceed with something of this magnitude, I'm required to suggest a consultation with one of our senior financial advisors. Perhaps we could discuss some other options, like a bridge loan or—" Jean cut him off, not unkindly, but with a finality that brooked no argument. She simply slid the piece of paper Eric had given her across the desk. It contained the Swiss account number and the precise wiring instructions. "It's for an urgent medical emergency for my husband," she said, her voice flat, a carefully constructed wall to hide the turmoil raging inside her. "It has to be done today." David looked from the paper to her face, searching her eyes for something, a hint of doubt, a sign of coercion. But all he saw was the unwavering, desperate determination of a wife on a mission. He sighed, a quiet admission of defeat, and began to type. The process took nearly an hour, a slow-motion demolition of her financial life. There were forms to sign, their pages filled with disclaimers in tiny print. There were identity verifications and security questions. With each stroke of the pen, with each initial she placed in a box, Jean felt another piece of her and Frank's carefully built future flaking away and turning to ash. Finally, David swiveled the monitor toward her. "The wire transfer has been initiated, Mrs. Peterson. It should be processed within the hour." On the screen, the balance of their life savings was displayed in stark black and white. $480,000. He clicked a button. And just like that, it was gone, replaced by a zero and a few cents. The number that had represented security, freedom, and their future was now just a ghost on a screen. Jean stood up, her legs feeling unsteady as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She managed a weak, polite smile. "Thank you, David." As she walked out of the bank and into the bright, indifferent sunlight, a single tear traced a path down her cheek. It wasn't a tear of sadness, but one of desperate, fragile hope. She had just purchased a chance at a future with Frank. She prayed it was enough. Weeks turned into a month. Frank came home, and a fragile sense of normalcy began to resod the crater that had been blown in their lives. He was taking a host of new pills that Eric had prescribed and arranged to have delivered from a special compounding pharmacy. He moved a bit slower, tired more easily, but his color was back, and the gentle humor had returned to his eyes. For Jean, however, the financial devastation was a constant low-grade hum beneath the surface of her days. She had told Frank they'd had to dip heavily into their savings for a specialist's consultation and treatment plan, a half-truth that felt like a boulder in her stomach. The full, ruinous truth was a secret she kept locked tightly behind a brave smile. Eric called her every few days to check in, his voice a soothing balm of reassurance. "You did the right thing, Aunt Jean," he would say. "He's alive because of you. You made the only choice you could." His words reinforced the narrative she clung to, the justification for their empty bank account. One Tuesday morning, Jean was back at the local hospital. It was for a routine blood test for her own thyroid medication, an appointment she had almost canceled, feeling too emotionally drained to deal with anything outside the bubble of her home. But the thought of her own health failing now was too terrifying to contemplate, so she went. The hallways were as bright and busy as she remembered, but the raw terror was gone, replaced by a weary familiarity. As she was leaving the lab, a folder with her results in hand, a doctor in a white coat rounded the corner, nearly bumping into her. He smiled apologetically as he sidestepped. "Pardon me, ma'am," he said, his eyes kind. Jean stopped short. A jolt of recognition went through her. "Dr. Thorne," she said, a genuine warmth infusing her voice. "You might not remember me, but I'm Jean Peterson. You were the first doctor to treat my husband, Frank, when he was brought into the ER last month." Dr. Thorne's expression cleared instantly. "Of course, Mrs. Peterson. I remember Mr. Peterson very well. I was just reviewing his follow-up scans last week. I was so pleased to see his condition remains quite stable. How is he doing now that he's home?" "He's doing wonderfully, thank you," Jean beamed, a swell of pride and overwhelming gratitude rising in her. She felt a need to share her miracle with the man who had been there at the beginning. "We were just so fortunate that my nephew, Dr. Vance, was able to step in. He's a cardiologist, you know. He took one look at the case and knew it was more serious than it appeared. He was able to enroll Frank in that special program. I truly believe it saved his life. I don't know what we would have done otherwise." She was expecting a nod of agreement, a shared look of professional satisfaction. Instead, Dr. Thorne's polite smile faltered. Professional satisfaction. It didn't disappear, but it tightened at the edges. A small, almost imperceptible frown line appeared between his eyebrows as he processed her words. He tilted his head slightly, a look of genuine, unfeigned bewilderment on his face. "His nephew, Dr. Vance?" he repeated slowly, as if trying to place the name in the context of the hospital. "I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with him. And what special program are you referring to, Mrs. Peterson?" The question was simple, clinical, and polite, but in the sterile, quiet hallway, it landed with the force of a physical blow. Jean's proud smile froze on her face. The low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead suddenly seemed deafening, intrusive. The world, which had just started to feel solid and manageable beneath her feet, had begun to tilt dangerously on its axis. Dr. Thorne's sincere confusion was a perfect, flawless mirror, reflecting a horrifying possibility that her mind had refused, until this very second, to even consider. Dr. Thorne, a man trained to read the subtle signs of cardiac distress, instantly recognized the look of profound shock on Jean's face. He saw the color drain from her cheeks, the way her hand flew to her throat. His clinical instincts took over, blended with simple human compassion. "Mrs. Peterson, why don't we step in here for a moment?" he said gently, his voice losing its casual tone and taking on one of professional concern. He guided her by the elbow into a small, empty family waiting area nearby. The room was stark and impersonal, furnished only with a few vinyl chairs and a table bearing a stack of outdated magazines. He gestured for her to sit and then, standing before her, pulled out a hospital-issued tablet from his lab coat pocket. "Let's just review this together, so we're on the same page," he said, his voice calm and even, a deliberate attempt to impose order on her rising chaos. He tapped the screen a few times, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency across the glass. "Okay, here we are. Frank Peterson, admitted on..." He read the date of the heart attack, confirming he had the right file. He knelt slightly, turning the tablet so Jean could see the screen clearly. It was Frank's official digital chart filled with clinical notes and data. "As you can see," Dr. Thorne began, pointing to a section of highlighted text, "Mr. Peterson presented with symptoms of an acute coronary event. After stabilization and a full cardiac workup, including an angiogram, we diagnosed him with stable angina pectoris. It's a very common condition, Mrs. Peterson, especially for men his age with his history. It simply means a part of the heart muscle isn't getting as much oxygen-rich blood as it needs, usually due to narrowed arteries. It's serious, but it is entirely manageable." Jean stared at the words on the screen. Stable angina. The phrase was so simple, so mundane. It sounded like a chronic inconvenience, not a death sentence. It was nothing like the terrifying, polysyllabic monster Eric had described. "But my nephew, Dr. Vance, he said it was cardiomyocytic degeneration," she whispered, the words feeling foreign and absurd on her tongue. "He said Frank's heart cells were dying. He said he needed an experimental enzyme therapy from a clinic in Switzerland." Dr. Thorne's frown deepened into a look of serious concern. He slowly scrolled through the file, page after digital page of notes, lab results, and discharge orders. He read silently for a moment, his eyes scanning the text. "Mrs. Peterson," he said finally, looking up from the tablet and meeting her gaze directly. "There is absolutely nothing in his file, not in my initial notes, not in the consulting cardiologist's official report, not in the discharge summary signed by 2 physicians, to suggest such a diagnosis. That is a very serious and very different condition. Mr. Peterson's heart muscle is sound, very serious, and his condition, while requiring lifelong attention, called for a standard, conservative treatment plan: aspirin, a beta blocker to regulate his heart rate, and a statin to manage cholesterol. All generic, all very affordable, all covered by his insurance. This experimental therapy, I've never even heard of it being used for a case like this. Medically speaking, it would have been completely, and I must stress this, completely unnecessary and inappropriate." The room began to spin. Jean gripped the vinyl arms of the chair, her knuckles turning white as she fought to stay upright. A roaring sound filled her ears, drowning out the distant hospital sounds. It was the sound of her own world shattering. The screen in front of her was not a lie. It was an official hospital record, a document of cold, hard, verifiable facts. The lie was the story she had been told in the safety of her own kitchen. The lie was the sympathetic look on Eric's face, the story of the Swiss colleague, the carefully chosen words of the only hope. The lie had cost them everything they had ever worked for. She stared at the simple typed words, stable angina, and the full, horrific truth crashed down upon her. She hadn't paid for a cure. She had paid for a story, and it had been a complete and utter fiction. The drive home was a 10-minute journey that felt like a voyage across a dead, gray sea. John moved on pure, unthinking autopilot, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly they ached, her knuckles white. The familiar streets of her neighborhood, the neighbor's dog barking, the kids' bikes left on a lawn, seemed alien, like a set from a movie about someone else's life. She pulled into her driveway and walked into her quiet house, the home that had always been her sanctuary, the scene of so much love and comfort, now felt tainted, violated. It was the stage upon which Eric had performed his monstrous play. She looked through the open door of their bedroom and saw Frank napping, the peaceful, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest a comfort, and a gut-wrenching reminder of the lie she had almost allowed to destroy them. A surge of protective fury, so intense it made her dizzy, washed over her. She didn't cry. The shock had flash-frozen her tears, hardening them into a core of cold, diamond-hard rage. She walked to the small mahogany desk in the living room, her movements stiff and deliberate, and picked up the phone. Her hand was perfectly steady. She dialed the number for her bank and asked to speak to David, the young manager who had seemed so concerned. Her voice, when she spoke, was eerily calm, stripped of all emotion but a chilling resolve. "David, it's Jean Peterson. You helped me with a large wire transfer a few weeks ago to an overseas account. I have reason to believe I have been the victim of a significant and calculated fraud, and I need your help immediately." The alarm in the young man's voice was immediate. The careful, professional politeness was gone, replaced by genuine urgency. He assured her he would do everything he could, that he was flagging the transaction and engaging the bank's fraud and security department right now. The process, he warned, could take time, but he sensed the profound distress in Jean's voice and promised to expedite it. Jean didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen table, a sentinel in the darkness, a cold cup of tea forgotten at her elbow. She didn't pace or wring her hands. She just sat, waiting for the final official confirmation of what she already knew in her bones. As the hours ticked by, her mind replayed her life not in flashes of memory, but as a series of exhibits in a trial. She pictured a photo on the mantelpiece, a smiling 10-year-old Eric at a family picnic, a boy she used to babysit, a boy whose scraped knees she had bandaged. She thought of his medical school graduation, how proud she and Frank had been, how they'd given him a generous check to help him get started. Every memory was now poisoned, recast as a step in a long, patient con. The call came just after 9 the next morning. It was David, his tone grim and stripped of all pleasantries. "Mrs. Peterson, we've traced the transfer. The account you wired the money to, it wasn't a medical clinic in Switzerland." He took a heavy breath. The funds were routed through 2 intermediary banks and deposited in an offshore shell corporation registered in the Cayman Islands. The corporation was founded 6 months ago. It's called Vance Innovations, LLC. Jean's eyes closed. There it was, the final nail. "We were able to access the public incorporation documents," David continued, his voice laced with a disbelief and anger that was clearly on her behalf. "There's only one director, one signatory on the account. There is no one else involved. Mrs. Peterson, I am so sorry to have to tell you this. The sole registered director of that corporation is Dr. Eric Vance." The last vestige of any possible improbable doubt dissolved into absolute certainty. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a premeditated, meticulously planned crime, executed with surgical precision by the person she had trusted most in the world. Her nephew, her white knight. He hadn't just stolen their money. He had held her love for Frank hostage. The grief for the lie finally broke through the shock, not in tears, but in a wave of ice-cold clarity. She knew exactly what she had to do next. The next morning, armed with a thick file containing the printed statement from the bank detailing the wire transfer to Vance Innovations, LLC, and a notarized, multi-page letter from a horrified doctor, Marcus Thorne, outlining Frank's actual diagnosis and the medical baselessness of any experimental therapy. Jean walked into the city police headquarters. She was no longer the frightened, vulnerable woman from the hospital waiting room. Her grief had been forged into a quiet, unshakable resolve. She sat across from a seasoned detective named Miller, a man with tired eyes who had clearly seen his share of human cruelty. She laid the documents neatly on his desk and, in a clear, steady voice, told her story from beginning to end. Detective Miller listened patiently, his initial expression of weary professionalism slowly changing as she spoke. He examined the documents, his eyes narrowing as he saw the pieces fit together: the local hospital's diagnosis, the conflicting story from a trusted family member, the offshore account, the name on the incorporation papers. It painted a clear, ugly, and undeniable picture of felony fraud, theft by deception, and financial exploitation of the elderly. An investigation was launched immediately, and with the bank and a cooperating doctor, Thorne providing evidence, it moved with swift, startling efficiency. 2 days later, Detective Miller called Jean. "It's time," was all he said. Dr. Eric Vance was in his gleaming, modern office, its large window offering a panoramic view of the city he felt he had conquered. He was laughing at a joke his wealthy new patient had told, the picture of charm and success, when 2 plainclothes detectives walked in without knocking. They flanked his polished mahogany desk, their grim, impassive presence immediately sucking all the air and levity out of the room. "Dr. Eric Vance?" one of them asked, though it was a statement, not a question. "You're under arrest for felony fraud and grand theft." The look of urbane confidence on Eric's face curdled into one of pure, uncomprehending shock. Urbane confidence. He started to bluster, to protest, to mention his lawyer, but the words died in his throat as they ordered him to stand and place his hands behind his back. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed in the stunned silence of his luxurious office. His carefully constructed world of respectability and authority crumbled in an instant. They led him out past his bewildered staff and the gaping patient, his expensive tailored suit now the pathetic uniform of a common criminal. That evening, Jean sat with Frank on their front porch swing, the air cool and sweet with the scent of her night-blooming jasmine. She had finally told him everything, from the terrifying diagnosis Eric had invented to the Cayman Islands bank account. He didn't speak for a long time, simply took her hand, his thumb stroking her knuckles in that familiar, comforting way. Their retirement savings were gone, frozen as evidence in a legal battle that would likely take years to resolve. Their future of travel and leisure was a ghost. But as the sun set, casting a warm orange glow over their small yard, Frank finally squeezed her hand. "He didn't get the most important thing, Jeannie," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "He took the money, but he didn't get us." Jean looked at him, at his kind eyes and the unwavering love that had been her anchor for 4 decades. The legal battle would be long and arduous. Eric faced a prison sentence that would strip him of his career, his freedom, and his honor. Justice would be served in a courtroom. But sitting there, with Frank's hand in hers, Jean understood the deeper truth. Their money was gone, but their bond, tested by a betrayal of unimaginable cruelty, remained. It was unbreakable. And for the first time since that terrible night, she felt a flicker of hope for a future that had nothing to do with money at all, but everything to do with the man beside her. They would be okay. They would start over, together.